Don't you hate it when you've made your sketch and for once it looks really good and you're sure that the painting is also gonna turn out really good?
2
And
hours
then...
later.
How did that happen? What the fuck? So today I'm gonna go over the 2 major mistakes you're making when you're shading, and I'm gonna show you a new technique which helps streamline the process so that you can turn your shading from this to this. Now let's go back in time and look at some of my old art. So this drawing has a lot of mistakes that could easily distract us, but what I want to focus on are the approaches I took which held me back from improving as much as I could.
What better way to help stupid people understand something than a graph? If you look down here, you see wrong decisions. Let's just say our wrong decisions are A through K. And then at the very end of it, you got your goal. And so intelligent failing is all about being okay with failing and realizing that you need to fail in order to move on to the next thing. Okay, pretty simple so far. Are you with me?
And so the approach I took, which held me back from improving as much as I could, was not using enough contrast. And you can have a contrast of anything. Contrast of colors, contrast of edges, contrast of shapes, but what we're focusing on is contrast of values. And the problem with the lack of contrast of values is that I wasn't forcing myself to make decisions about the form I was describing, and that's what shading is. You're describing the form using light and shadow. The reason I was hesitant to use contrast and describe the form is because I didn't really know the form. I mean, I was new to painting, I was new to art, I didn't understand the form of the human face. Once I started using stronger light scenarios, I leveled up a lot faster. So this one is an interesting example because I actually got the light wrong here. He's supposed to be sitting underneath a campfire, so with the light coming from below, the light would not be able to bounce off of this plane on his forehead into our eyes. I believe the planes that would actually be in light would be these ones, so let's see if we can do an overpaint to fix it. So here, I forced myself to make a decision, and I made the wrong decision. But that's still good. It's better to make the wrong decision than to make no decision at all. But if you want to know how to make the right decision, use reference. So these pieces were made in the same time frame, and for this one I didn't use a reference, and for this one I did. And I think it's pretty clear, like the light in this one is much more sound. The main mistake here is not using enough contrast, which leads to not forcing yourself to describe the form. And describing the form is a lot easier if you avoid a second mistake, which is color. If we go back to the first piece I showed, one of the mistakes that could have easily distracted us is the colors. The colors here are really bad, but that's just a distraction from the real problem, which is the values. Even if you aspire to create art where colors play a huge role, let's take Sam does art for example, the colors here are beautiful, but they wouldn't work if the values weren't good. Now let me showcase how I recommend approaching shading. So here's a picture of my hand that I took. Got some pretty cool colors, too bad. So there are 3 things you need to think about when shading. The form of the subject. Just start simple, you can add all the curves and the bumps later. The light sources. There's 3 light sources in this picture. You've got the skylight coming in from the window. You've got the sunlight also shining in through the window. And you got the bounce light, which is the sunlight hitting the floor and then bouncing up on my arm. Now usually bounce light is more of an afterthought, but here the bounce light is so strong it seems reasonable to consider it its own light source. Lastly, you have to consider the material. My hand here is made of skin so that I appear human. So instead of starting with light as your base color and then adding shadows, we're going to start with the shadow as your base color and then add light. It's much easier to think about where the light source would hit when you start out with shadows. And I think it's easier to capture the full range of values when you start out with the shadows, because you realize how dark the shadows can get. Now obviously, if like most of your subject is in light and there's very few shadows, it doesn't make a lot of sense to start out with the shadows, but you should really be studying photos with some strong shadows. Anything beyond this point is just rendering. Now, in all of the shading tutorials, all of them, everybody loves to bring up the good old sphere.
Right now, it would seem from my painting that there is a direct spotlight shining on our ball here.
Wow!
Light bounces everywhere, and so the light bounces a little bit here, making it lighter. Don't listen to those dumb as hell WikiHow tutorials, only listen to me, because I know everything.
Are you sure about that?
You got the form shadow, you got the cast shadow, motherfuckers talking about the core shadow and the Terminator, but I'm an idiot, and I find it hard to apply things that are showcased with simple forms on complex forms like the human face. So let's do a painting of a face. The woman in this photo has got to be the prettiest woman I've ever seen, but it's also a great reference for highlights. So let's go over highlights real quick. Light bounces off everything it hits. When light bounces off a plane and then shoots into our general direction, that plane will be in light. When light bounces off something and then bounces directly into our eyes, that plane will be in highlight. That's why when you move around, the highlight on something also moves. The cheeks being darker here is not just because of blush. The front plane of the cheekbone faces forward, but since the light is kind of coming from the side, that plane will receive less light compared to the side plane of the nose, for example. Now let's get a bit more advanced and look at ways you can make your lights and shadow more painterly and stylized. So we observe things based on light bouncing off objects. With less light, we have less information. So something you'll see a lot of great painters do is exaggerating the loss of information, the loss of detail happening in the shadow areas, which you can see here in this Sargent piece. I tried to do a study of this photo and play around with this loss of detail in the shadows to then merge the shadows together, but it went kind of meh. Now let's look at the light version of this. So something that can happen during sunrise or sunset when the sun is at a very low angle is that the light can become so strong it's basically pure white, which leads to a loss of detail in the light areas. I used this light scenario to paint my dog. So here you can see the fur that is in light. There's no texture going on here. It's just pure white. And I really love using this kind of light scenario when painting stylized characters. Since it's so simplified, I just skip shadows altogether and I only use light to describe the form. So here is a little me, and I just take a hard brush and I set it to a yellow that's very close to pure white. And there's two small things I do to make it even better. So I add a glow effect with an airbrush set to pure white on the light areas, which adds this kind of like hazy, dreamy effect, which I really like. It's kind of reminiscent of how older cameras used to process light. and another layer set to color dodge to exaggerate the effects of light fall off and subsurface scattering, which are two effects that you could talk about for a long time and make seem really complicated, but what it means is that you basically add an extra dash of saturation around the edges of light. And additionally, with subsurface scattering, you can add a ton of saturation when the light shines through, like the ears. There's a specific artist that in my mind is the best at shading, or one of the best. And in this video, I go over how I study her and what I've learned from it.